holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God. In it you shall not do any work. Then 7 people are mentioned here. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who is in your gates. And then a rationale is given. For in 6 days the Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. And therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. Now, last week we started on this and saw that this word has the same pattern as the second. You will not make any graven image, period. And then there's an expansion. As regards any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth, you will not worship them or serve them. And then there's a rationale. Because I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God. Here we have the same thing. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, period. And then there's an expansion. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God, etc. And then there's a rationale. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, etc. That is a formula that's used for these 2 commandments. And it's instructive, I think, to notice that that's what's going on. That helps us to come to grips with the content of the commandment, especially with the second one, which so often is translated in a kind of confusing way. This one we're more used to, the way it's put out. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We discussed that last time. Keeping it holy implies the holy convocation and so forth. And then we'll see more about that today. Here we read the expansion of it. 6 days you shall labor and you shall do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God. You shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your manservant or your maidservant or your cattle or your sojourner who is in your gates. We're still looking at the details. The word labor here is the word for service. You will not do any service on the Sabbath day, on the day of rest. There are different words for work and labor. Here it implies service to the master. It's not a word that means laborious, hard, sweaty work. There are different words for that. Here it is a word that implies service to a master. So I think that the larger idea is that God is the master and we work for Him 6 days. And then we enter into His rest on the seventh. Then the word work is used. You shall not do any work. And here the word is not a word for activity or even laborious activity, but rather it's a word that means productive activity. And as you see in your notes, it seems to be related to the word for messenger, angel. The word angel in the Hebrew, or messenger, is malach. And the word for work is malakah. These are very similar in Hebrew. In fact, they look almost identical. One is masculine, one's feminine. In Hebrew, it looks like this. M-L-K is messenger, and work is M-L-K-H. That's all you see in Hebrew. All the vowel sounds are added in. So they're very similar words, and they're probably related to each other. So what does a messenger or an angel do? He does what God tells him to do. His work or activity is what is commissioned. And also implied in it is that the angel of the Lord is the very image of the Lord Himself, and we are all lesser angels of the Lord, images of the Lord. And so just as God works 6 days, so we work. The kind of work we're supposed to stop doing is the kind of work that God did on His 6 days, because we're the images of God. And the kind of rest we're to engage in is the kind of rest He engaged in. And that will help us, I think, when we get around to what can you do and what can you not do on Sunday type questions, which is where everybody always needs to go with this. And we want to be faithful, and we want to know what God would approve of and what He doesn't. But this will help us. What's not said, you can't do anything, you have to rest all day, you've got to sit in a chair all day, you can't go to the beach, you can't break a sweat, or whatever. What it says is, don't engage in the kind of work that God does, the kind of work God has commissioned you to do. And we'll get to all these details as we go. So, 6 days you will labor and do all your work. Labor is just service. Work is production. And notice there's no implication of the curse here. It's not 6 days you will just slave away under the curse and finally you get a day off. That's not the idea. This is your pre-fall Adamic creation activity, what people would have done quite apart from the fall. They would still have worked 6 days and entered into rest on the seventh because they're the images of God. So it's the creation Sabbath that's in view here, as we see from the rationale, because God worked 6 days and rested one. There's no indication of a curse here in the words labor or work, in other words. Then it says the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God. Sabbath, remember from last time, means a cessation or stopping. And the seventh day is the day that God ceases. And therefore his angel, his image, ceases. The angel of the Lord ceases. The image of the Lord ceases and stops. Then it lists all these people, and here it becomes interesting. It's not interesting that the wife is left off. I think in order to keep the sevenfold structure here, she is included in the statement you. You, your son, your daughter. You are one flesh with your wife, so obviously if you stop, she stops. Now, the one flesh idea covers that. But what's interesting is the way this is set out. You, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your cattle, your sojourner. What's listed here are members of a household, as well as the sojourner. And it contemplates a household activity, not household enterprise, not mere activity. It's your household enterprise that stops. So if your household economy, or if your job that your manservant and maidservant and cattle are involved in, and your son and daughter are involved in, if you're a blacksmith, then that's what stops. And then finally, it says the sojourner who is in your gates, which implies a national aspect. See, a sojourner is the foreigner, the believing foreigner. He can't live in the land. Why can't he live in the land? Why doesn't it say the sojourner who lives in the land? Is it possible for a sojourner to live in the land? Well, he has to be circumcised to stop being a sojourner. Well, a sojourner can live in the land if an Israelite becomes so poor that he leases his land out to him until the Jubilee year, but in the Jubilee all the land is going to revert to an Israelite. And so in terms of permanent tenure, a sojourner can never own land in the Holy Land. So the sojourners and strangers always lived in the cities, because the city land was not under the Jubilee law. This is all in Leviticus 25. The city land is not under the Jubilee law, and city land, just for fun, Numbers defines it, a city is a fenced city or a walled city, and you count 1,000 cubits out in every direction and form a square, and that is the city land, and it doesn't come under the Jubilee. So a stranger or a foreigner can own property here. An Israelite can own property here. He can sell it just like in a modern society. In the New Covenant, the city of God covers everything, and so now all of our property is that way. We don't have a Jubilee law where everything reverts in the 50th year. In fact, how would you work it? Who would it go back to? But in Israel they did, so the sojourners live in the gates. Well, the sojourner is probably not going to be part of your household, and so when it says he's not to do any work, who's going to enforce that? I, in my own household and business enterprise, I can give all my servants a day of rest. I can give my sons and daughters a day of rest. Who gives the sojourner the day of rest? Well, the answer is the government gives him the day of rest. And see, this idea of giving rest is the primary idea in the Sabbath, which makes it very theocratic. Unless you have a Christian government, you're not going to get this. And so the focus in this commandment, as I have down here in number 2, is on giving rest. And that, as we've said before, is the theme of the book of Exodus. You start out in work, and in fact it's not just ordinary work like the commandment contemplates, but it's severe hardship, labor and bondage type work. And then you get rest from it that God gives. And God gives rest by setting up a political structure that requires employers to give employees one day off. Otherwise they work forever. It's a labor law. What prevents the poor from being exploited? Well, certain laws that God gives prevent the poor from being exploited. And in this case, as we'll see, there is a death penalty attached to certain kinds of violations of the Sabbath. So at least in Israel, it was a civil law that God gave. God gave rest to the people, and He commands the government to see to it that people are enabled to take that rest. Now, if we look at Deuteronomy 5:14 and 15, we'll see the same idea, where Moses preaches on this, and Moses gives a somewhat different slant to the Sabbath commandment, but in doing so, he brings out the idea that the Sabbath is rest that's given, not rest that's taken. The seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God. This is Deuteronomy 5, verse 14. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. See, there's more listed here. So that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Now notice the idea here is you enter into rest, and your servants enter into rest with you. Now what is that parallel to? God enters into rest, and we enter into rest with Him. God works 6 days and rests on the seventh, and so God's male and female servants rest as well as Him. That's the theology of it. So then it's reproduced at the human level. God enters into rest and brings His servants with Him. We enter into rest and bring our servants with us. Then verse 15, you shall remember you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore Yahweh your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So God gave you rest, therefore you give rest. And this brings up something that's, I think, relevant to American history and to the history of Calvinism, and that is, in the Bible we never see people demanding the Sabbath day or obeying the commandment to rest as a direct moral command. You don't see that. You don't see Joseph in Potiphar's house after 6 days when Potiphar says, okay, now I want you to go clean out the stalls. You don't see Joseph saying, how can I do this great sin against God? I won't do it, and refusing. Why? Because Joseph hadn't been given rest. And so since he hadn't been given rest, I imagine Joseph worked pretty much every day except for certain days that Potiphar let him off. Or maybe the Egyptians had 1 day a month off. In Rome, they had certain set days off. Remember the Ides of March? Well, that was a holiday. That's how come they were having a procession in the street on the Ides of March. And Caesar could be killed on that day. Well, that's not a weekly Sabbath idea. The Ides is the 15th day after every new moon, so it was off. But that's not the biblical Sabbath. And I don't think they let their slaves rest on those days in Greece and Rome. I doubt if they did in Egypt either, at least when Joseph first went down there. But we do see Joseph refusing to commit adultery even though his boss commanded him to. And you see there's a difference in the way those laws are set out and what they mean. It's never right to commit adultery. But the command to observe the Sabbath day is not addressed, first of all, to people as individuals. Every maidservant in Israel has a right to say, I refuse to work. Now, maybe the maidservant has a right to complain, and the civil magistrate in Israel might speak to her master. The question is, once you get outside of biblical society, do you see people demanding days of rest? The answer is no. You don't see it in the early church. You don't see people becoming Christians and then saying, we're not going to work on Sunday anymore. What you do see is the society gradually becomes Christian, and Constantine comes to power, and Constantine gives everybody Sunday off. Then you can take Sunday off. So there's no sin in working on Sunday if your boss requires it. The sin is in requiring others to work when there's no need to. That's what's wrong. See, it'd be wrong, I believe, if the headmaster of the school said, everybody's got to come down here on Sunday afternoon and work for 4 hours, because he's making them work. The problem isn't with them, the problem is with the boss. And then I think the Bible implies that if God gives you rest and you refuse it, then you despise grace. So if you're given a day of rest, and in our society, most of us are given Sunday as a day of rest, and we don't take it as a day of rest, then we got a problem. But if God doesn't give it to you through the chain of command that He set up, and see, this commandment is all phrased in terms of a chain of command. You will not do any work, and those under you. I've given it to you. If you haven't been given rest, then there's no sin in not resting. Now that becomes a tricky business. I think that here's a young man who needs to get a job, and he goes down to the grocery store, some other store, and they say, yeah, we'll give you a job, but everybody starts working on Sunday. So what does he do? Well, I can't have that job. And he goes from one job to another, and it's all the same. You start at the bottom of the pile, and you have to work on Sunday. What do? Well, I think you take a job. And you say, at this stage of my life, I haven't been given rest. I haven't been given as much rest. You're going to get Wednesday afternoon off instead of Sunday morning or something. It's best, I think, to go to the elders of the church, discuss it with them, and get it all cleared out. But in a society like ours, there's less rest being given than formerly. Formerly, 30 years ago, most of these stores weren't open, and people looking for work would not be constrained to work on Sunday. Now they are. There's less rest. But in Israel, you see, the rest is given. God calls them out of Egypt. God kills everybody who disagrees, and so by the time they get into the promised land, they're all going to do what He said, and they're all going to keep the Sabbath day. And anybody who gathers sticks is going to be put to death. So it's all made real clear. If you don't have that, then you can't keep it. So that's the implication, I believe, of the way it's phrased. If it just said, Sabbath day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, you shall not do any work in it, we might draw from that, well, this is like you shall not commit adultery. You shall not kill. You will never do any work. Even if they throw you into jail, even if they put you to death, you just don't do any work. Be a martyr. But that's not the way it's phrased. It's when you're given it, you're supposed to take it. And so in the New Testament, Paul says don't make an issue out of the Sabbath. In the early church, nobody did. But once the Sabbath came in, then you should keep it. Keep what it means to keep it is what we have to look at in more detail.
In requiring we as Christians patronize gas stations, stores, and restaurants, and so forth, should we interpret that as us requiring someone else to work on Sunday?
I don't think so. In my belief, if those stores are already open and we have some need to take advantage of them, then it's not our problem.
It's the employer, not the customer that drives it.
Yeah, it's the employer and not the customer that is the problem here. If you look at the statement about meat sacrificed to idols, I think that's similar. They ought not to sacrifice that meat to idols, but they did, but so what? You can still buy it. Kmart ought not to be involved with Walden Books and selling pornography, but they are. I don't think that means you can't go to Kmart. Maybe if there's a Walmart right next to it, you ought to go to Walmart. But if the nearest Walmart is 30 miles away, you're probably going to wind up going to Kmart, and I wouldn't worry about it. And I think the same thing's here. If the store is open on Sunday and there's some reason for you to go. But in the main, I think we as Christians would not make our major shop on Sunday, just because we would tend to want to encourage the store not to stay open. And we might write a letter to the head of Kmart and complain or something. I don't know that any place in the Bible lays that out as a rule, that we should try to bring pressure in that way. Well, a lot of these questions we want to get to later. I don't see a problem with traveling on Sunday because it's not my normal work to drive a car. It's not what I do to make money, and it's not laborious. Now, if I miss church, that's a problem. If it involved walking or wearing my horse out to travel on Sunday, then I'm not giving rest to my horse or to me. But the increase of technology continually changes what is involved in keeping the Sabbath day holy, I think. Since you raised the question, I'll go ahead and make this comment. One of the things that got John Murray in trouble in Scotland is because he was so liberal. It sounds ridiculous to say John Murray was liberal, but he was so liberal that he said it was okay for people to ride the streetcars to go to church. And the Free Church of Scotland put him out because it's a sin to use public transportation, because that means somebody has to drive the thing, and you're making them work. You're making them work. And Murray said, this is really a work of necessity in a city, and it's okay for those guys to drive those buses, and it's okay for people to ride those buses. And that was regarded as too liberal. So he came over here and taught at Westminster and fled Scotland because he was too liberal. Well, we can discuss that more about 8 weeks from now when we get there. And it shouldn't take that long to get down to that level. Let's go on to the rationale here. I think if we can lay out some theological patterns and canons, they'll help us with some of the specifics. The rationale given in the form of the 10 Commandments that God dictated. And remember, Exodus 20 is different from Numbers 5. Numbers 5 is Deuteronomy 5 is Moses preaching a sermon, and Moses rehearses the 10 words, and he rehearses them in slightly different language. Of course, this is under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It's equally authoritative, but it doesn't have the same place in the Bible in the canon as this does, because this is what God spoke from heaven. This is what God wrote with His own finger. And the rationale that's given here goes back to creation and shows the Sabbath as a creation ordinance. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but He rested on the seventh day. Because of this, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I remember we pointed out last time that in Genesis 1 it's Elohim that does this. Here it's Yahweh, and that indicates, of course, to the Israelite that Yahweh is the same as Elohim, which they probably didn't have much question about any more than any of us would. But then the rationale is what's important. The image of God follows the pattern set by God Himself. God works 6 days. God rests on the seventh. God didn't have to do it that way. He could have made the world over 6 billion years. He could have made the world in 6 seconds and rested on the seventh second. But that wouldn't have set any pattern for us, because that's not how we live. If He had made it in 6 centuries and rested in the 7th century, that wouldn't set a pattern for us, because that's not how we live. That's not how He designed us to live. If He designed us to live a lifespan of 30,000 years, maybe if He'd worked for 6 decades and rested on a 7th decade, that would fit the rhythm of our life. But since He designed us to live about 1,000 years long, and of course our lives have shrunk quite a bit from that original design, we don't know how long Adam would have lived in this world before he got out of it and made room for his grandchildren. But the way God made human life, He made us to work 6 days and rest on the 7th, and then He turned around and did the same thing Himself to set a pattern for us. No other reason why He would. There's no internal necessity in God that causes Him to make the world in 6 days and rest in the 7th. He does it entirely to set a pattern for us. So that pattern is set. And that's what's being said here. So let's talk today, in the time that remains, about some of the fundamental meanings of the Sabbath. The Sabbath, as I see it, involves, first of all, worship, because God rests in His world with His people, and they have to affirm His primacy. We'll talk about that. Second of all, it involves rest, because God has stopped what He was doing, His normal activity and labor, His productive, creative work. And so we imitate Him. And then there's an element of festivity or recreation. And the reason is that God rests in the world and not apart from it. God enjoys what He's made. So we can enjoy nature and culture. We can enjoy what God made and what we made. And there's an element of festivity. And of course we saw that last time when we looked at Deuteronomy and the expansion of this law in Deuteronomy, where the 3 annual festivals where people can use their money to buy anything they want, wine or beer or beef or lamb or whatever, and make merry before God. That's a festival idea. And when you've got a whole bunch of people coming with their whole families and building little tents around the tabernacle, and the whole nation is camped in tents for a week, that's recreation. You don't get your kids together and put up a tent and live that way around all these other people without it being a festivity. And there's no fasting there. It's all feasting. So it's kind of hard to make it out to be anything other than a festival. So festival and recreation and fun are entirely legitimate activities on the Sabbath. But we don't want our festivity to become so intense that we don't rest. And we don't want to rest so much that we miss church. So there's an order. Worship first, rest second, festivity third. Now, the first thing I think we have to say about the Sabbath is that it represents the enthronement of God. God rests from His work, and in the Bible, the word Sabbath means to cut off or stop or cease. But the Sabbath idea is a whole lot more than just cutting off, stopping, and ceasing. The word may be related to the idea of just stopping. God stops what He does on Sunday and starts it up again on Monday. People debate, does God stop working and go into perpetual eternal Sabbath, or does He do some more work on Monday? Well, there's no answer to that. Because God is an eternally active God, and He doesn't even exist in time. But see, our Sabbath, we stop on Sunday, we start back again on Monday. In the Old Testament, they stopped on Saturday and started back again on Sunday. But it's not just stopping. In the Bible, the Sabbath idea or concept involves enthronement. And that's because there's a pattern in the Bible, and it's what we call the victory house building pattern. And the victory house building pattern basically looks like this. You have an enemy, and the enemy is defeated, and you take the spoils from the enemy and you build a house out of it. And once the house is built, you enter into the house, and the sign that you occupy the house is that you start the fire on the hearth. And once you've entered the house and start the fire on the hearth, you turn the house over to stewards to manage. Now, where do we see that? Well, the fundamental occurrence of it in the Bible, the first one anyway, is in the book of Exodus. The enemy that's defeated is Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And what do we get from the Egyptians? All this spoil. And what do we build with the spoil? The tabernacle. We're going to see that. And then at the end of the book of Exodus, God enters the tabernacle. And as a sign of His enthronement, He kicks off His shoes. He doesn't do that in the text, but if He had shoes, He'd kick them off. And He starts the fire up. In verse 38, it ends. Throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night in the sight of all the house of Israel. And in Leviticus, we find that Leviticus goes back in Exodus 40, and there, with the last verse of Leviticus 9, the fire is actually started on the hearth, on the altar, which is called a hearth. And then the house is turned over to stewards. And who are the stewards who maintain the house? The priests. That's what they are, household stewards. They keep the place clean. You keep the tabernacle clean by putting blood on things from time to time, because cleansing is moral when it comes to the tabernacle. So you put blood on the horns of the altar. You sprinkle blood around on different things at different times. The stewards are going to guard the house and keep bad people out. So these priests are armed. The house is turned over to stewards. Now, where do we see this pattern happen again? Who's the next great enemy, and what's the next great house that's built? Yeah, we're talking about the temple now. What's the enemy that's defeated, and where do the spoils come from to build the temple? Yeah, and primarily David conquers the Philistines. The Philistines are Egyptians, according to Genesis chapter 10. So the Philistines, Egyptians are defeated, and so are the other nations. And we have in Chronicles, it talks about how David gathered all this stuff together year after year. And Solomon builds the house, and God enters the house, and what does He do? They remember it. Starts a fire on the altar once again. And then the management of the house is turned over to stewards. And that whole system is reorganized. We don't read Chronicles very much, but if we were to read it, we'd find whole lists of singers and a whole list of musical instrument players, because the musical instruments were invented at this time and put in. David invented them under divine inspiration, and they're put in. And they become part of the furniture of the house. And the priesthood is reorganized. In the tabernacle, you had a high priest and you had the priests. But what happens to the priests in David's day? Does anybody remember? You have the high priest and you have the priests, and in between you have the chief priests. 24 of them. That's why when you get down to the New Testament, it talks about the chief priests. You ever wonder who the chief priests are? Well, they're set up in David's day for the temple. So the whole management of the house, which is much bigger, is turned over. But there's something interesting that happens in the day of the temple, and this will help us to understand the Sabbath. God's finished His work of defeating the enemy, and He builds His house out of all this spoil, and He starts His fire. But when the temple is set up, right next to it, built at the same time with a continuous pavement in between, is the palace of the king. And if we were to read 1 Kings 7 and 8, we would find that God's house is finished, and it sits empty for 7 years while Solomon's house is being built. And the day that God enters His house and starts the fire on His hearth is the same day that Solomon enters his house. God holds off enthroning Himself until His image is ready to be enthroned. What we have is an advance in history. In the tabernacle day, no man got to go and be enthroned next to God. But when we get to the temple, then at the right side of the temple, on the right hand, the human king is enthroned the same time God is. Now, they're in two separate buildings. The king is still not allowed to go into this temple here. When Uzziah tried, he was struck with leprosy. But we've moved forward. When we get to the New Testament, we find the enemy is defeated. In the Gospels, the enemy is primarily Israel. We don't find Jesus fighting Romans. We find Him fighting the apostate priests of the nation of Israel. He builds a house out of spoils. The spoils are the Old Testament. All the good things that are in the Old Testament are reworked and taken into the New. Then Jesus enters His house and starts a fire on the hearth. What house does He enter? When do we see Him enter the house? The ascension. And where's the fire? We're the altar, and the fire comes down and starts a fire on the heads of the people. And then the house is turned over to stewards. The New Testament has a lot to say about that, elders, deacons, and all the rest. Now, that's a pattern. And because we have the whole rest of the Bible, we're in a position, and I should say, there you see a man actually inside the same house with God seated at his right hand. So at that point, a man really enters into Sabbath for the first time in a full sense. We'll come back to that. Now we're looking at God. In Genesis chapter 1, we don't really have an enemy to defeat, but we have a problem to solve, don't we? God could have made the world perfect and nice all at once. He could have made it good all at once. It could say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God looked at what He made, and behold, it was good. But that's not what it says. It says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there's three problems. They're not bad. There's nothing immoral about them. It's not an enemy. It's not chaos. It's not something God has to defeat. But it's a problem that God solves before He says it's good. The earth was formless, and it was empty, and it was dark. And God takes care of the darkness problem right away and says that the light is good, separates light from darkness. And then He takes care of the formless problem by separating things, separates the waters above from the waters below, separates the land from the sea. He takes care of the emptiness problem by setting up rulers. He sets up the stars and the sun to rule the day and night. He sets up the birds and the fish to multiply and have dominion, and the beasts and man also. So He takes care of the problem, and when He's all done, it's very good. God saw all that He had made, and behold, it was very good. The heavens and the earth were completed, and then God enters the house and, so to speak, starts the fire on the house and turns the management of the house over to stewards. Now, we can watch how this is done here in the first form of it in Genesis 2 and 3. God builds a garden. God puts Adam in the garden, but God goes into the garden too. But then He turns the garden over to Adam and Eve, and He leaves. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Why is that in Genesis 2? Because Adam and Eve were just married, and so they're going to leave God in some sense. God is the Father. And so we find that God does leave, because in chapter 3, God comes back. He leaves and lets them run things for a few hours, and then He comes back in the cool of the evening. So He turns the management of the house over to stewards. Now that's what it means for God to be enthroned in Sabbath, you see. God rests. Now, with that in mind, what kind of rest is it? Well, letter C, God rests within His house, the world. See, that's important. We don't read that God goes away. Every time God enthrones Himself in Sabbath rest, He's inside the house He's made. He doesn't take off, go back to heaven and leave the world. He's inside the house He's made in some sense. He's relaxing in it. So the Sabbath is not world rejection, but world appreciation. And it's not works rejection, but works appreciation. We don't reject the world any more than God did. God relaxed and enjoyed the world of nature that He had made. In God's case, nature and culture are the same thing. But we draw a distinction between what God makes, which is nature, and what we make, which is culture. We reorganize the world and make culture. So we can relax and enjoy a house that we've made, which is culture, you see. The houses don't grow out of the ground. We have to work and make them. So that's culture. That's a work. We don't make a house on Sunday, but we can enjoy our house on Sunday. And we can enjoy nature, which is God's house. So what does that mean? Can you go to the beach on Sunday? Yeah. Can you go for a walk in the woods? Sure. Can you swim in the beach? Yeah. Should you get worn out swimming at the beach? Probably not. Can you listen to a concert? Yes. Now, if you're a professional musician, would Sunday be a good day to compose music in the Old Testament? No. Would it be a good day to practice 6 hours on the piano to learn to play a piece? No. But would it be a good day to sit down and play a piece that you've already learned and relax? Play it for other people so they can appreciate it? Yeah. In the temple, they were blowing those trumpets, playing those musical instruments, and singing on the Sabbath day when the sacrifices were offered. You see the difference here? You produce your things on 6 days. You present them to God, relax and enjoy them on the 7th. But what relaxing and enjoying means, it may involve activity and endeavor, but it doesn't involve practice and hard work. I don't see a problem if you already know how to play a Beethoven sonata with sitting down and playing it on Sunday, but I wouldn't practice it up. Take out the first 5 measures and play them 20 times to get your fingers in the right place. That's not the day for that, so to speak. If that's your job, if that's your work. That's an implication of God resting within His house on the Sabbath day. Another implication that comes from the enthronement of God is that since Adam and Eve are in the house, God rests with His people. And we've seen that already. It implies that there's a holy assembly on the Sabbath day. Right from the beginning, we've seen that the synagogue holy assembly pattern is set up in Leviticus 23, but it's there by implication from the beginning. God rests with His people, and so that means they would come together with Him on the Sabbath day. And that leads to the next point, and the last point in this section. On the Sabbath, we are to affirm the primacy of God and the primacy of His enthronement. Primacy of God and the primacy of His enthronement. He's enthroned first, and He's enthroned as sovereign. We may also become enthroned or finish our work, set it aside, and certain things that are completed we can relax and enjoy, but ours is secondary. So especially in the Old Testament, they were required to let their hearth fire shrink down so that God's hearth fire was clearly revealed on the Sabbath day. Exodus 35 says it this way: Moses assembled all the congregation of the sons of Israel and said to them, "These are the things that Yahweh has commanded you to do. For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day you are to have a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death." And we'll come back to what kind of work that is later. "You shall not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day." Now that doesn't mean you can't have a fire. It doesn't say you may not start a fire. We think of kindling a fire is getting it going, but this means you're not to build it up. You can keep the coals alive, but you're not to build it up. And the reason is, on the Sabbath day, there's much more fire on God's altar, because there are 2 lambs sacrificed in the morning and 2 sacrificed in the evening. And other sacrifices are generally offered on the Sabbath too. People have a day off, so that's the day they're going to bring offerings. So that God's fire is going to burn real bright all day long. What was the main thing you put on? The one part of the whole burnt offering, you put the whole animal on. But purification offerings and peace offerings, the one essential part of the animal that had to be put on, do you remember what it was? It was the fat. You're just constantly feeding this fire with fat, it's going to burn real bright. So the idea is, we let our hearth fire shrink so that His is clearly revealed. It affirms His primacy. And worship in general is the ritual affirmation of the primacy of God. We are here to affirm the primacy of God, not to do something else.
Jim, would you care to, first of all, to elaborate a little further on this ritual affirmation of the primacy of God? Do you have time to do that? Are you prepared to do that?
Well, I don't know what I would say beyond that. In other words, we're here to acknowledge God as sovereign.
To a ritual affirmation, typical in the other mind.
Well, in the Old Testament, you see this requirement that 3 times a year all the men are to gather together and stand before God. And there's a sense in which there's a ritual aspect in a real broad sense. I think I see what you're getting at now. But just in a broad sense, the fact that we're called to come here, even if we didn't get anything out of the sermon, even if we didn't like the hymns, even if we didn't agree with the Sunday school lesson, etc., we're still supposed to come and present ourselves before God and affirm His primacy and His sovereignty and our submission to Him by the simple act of coming together.
Does that also involve the way we do that today? Does that involve a certain amount of what we could call a ritual? Is there a prescribed ritual for us today with some of the details that you had described in the Old Testament, or are we given a lot of liberty in how we do this?
Well, we'll come to that next week, I guess, but we are given more liberty because we're not told exactly what time to meet and things like that in regards to a lot of things. They were told to sacrifice the evening sacrifice between the time the sun went down and the time it got dark. And the hours were set for a lot of things. With us, it's not set quite that way. But at the same time, there is a structure to worship that's laid out in both the Old and New Testament that we're supposed to follow.
This is becoming more and more meaningful to me. It ever has in my entire Christian life, because I never was exposed to any of this while I was in, say, Baptist church. They didn't think along this line. Or when I was in independent circles, we just were not trained at all to think like this. But this idea of coming and presenting yourself before God, whether you get all that much out of it or not, that's really becoming very meaningful to me.
Bob?
Bottom line point would be that when we do come together on the Lord's Day, it has to be God-focused. It's not that we're going there to get warm fuzzies and stuff like that. We're there to worship God. It's God-focused.
Right.
Now, there ought to be, I would suggest, that we are refreshed in worship as well. It's sort of a spin-off. The focus has to be on God, not on us.
Yeah. It should follow that we're refreshed in worship because, being the images of God, it should be more refreshing than anything else. And I think perhaps by faith we have to insist that it is, even if it doesn't feel refreshing to us, because we're sinners, our perception is off. But that doesn't mean that worship can be sloppy. It just means that, obviously, as you said, the focus is on God. Okay, we're right at the end of this section, so we can stop that today. Just to say that Adam refused to admit the primacy of God on the first Sabbath. That's the essence of his sin. We come to the first Sabbath, and God had given him a real simple command: don't do this. Completely arbitrary. There were 100 trees he could eat from. He could eat from the tree of life if he wanted a special tree, but he had to have the one thing that wasn't there. And see, by breaking that arbitrary command, the very arbitrariness of it is what asserts the primacy of God. There's no other rationale for it. Just do it because I say so. That's the bottom line on authority. Whether it's with your kids, our kids, or anything else, there comes a point at which, do it because I say so. Why? Because I'm the boss. That's what Adam didn't do. And so Adam is excluded from Sabbath. Adam doesn't enter into Sabbath rest. He's kicked out. And until Jesus comes along, nobody really gets to enter into Sabbath rest in the Old Testament. And we'll see that next time. Another passage in closing that talks about affirming the primacy of God is Isaiah 58:13 and 14, which says, "If because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of Yahweh honorable, and shall honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your pleasure, and from speaking your word, then you will take delight in Yahweh, and I will make you right on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken." Now, this is sometimes misinterpreted where it says, if you will turn away from doing your own pleasure, to mean you ought not to enjoy Sunday. But see, your own pleasure here means doing your own will. It means disobeying God. And it's interesting how the climax of the verse 13 says, speaking your own word. The sin of man to speak his own word in the face of God and not to submit to God's word. And that's what's being spoken of here. The Sabbath is the day in which we set aside to hear God's word and to stop doing our works and affirm His works, focus our attention on His works, and offer our works to Him, what we've finished. And then, if that's the case, then there are all these blessings that come from it. Well, next time we'll talk about the enthronement of man. If the Sabbath is the day in which God is enthroned, it's also the day in which man is enthroned, because man is the image of God. Adam didn't get to that point because of his sin. Jesus did. What does that mean for us? And we'll talk about that next time. Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the gift of a day of rest, a day of recreation and worship that you've given to us. And we ask that you would help us to rest this day and also to worship you. Accept us in Jesus, and accept us as we offer ourselves to you in His name. Amen.